What's up, guys? Welcome to this week's episode of Best Bets for UFC 321, Tom Aspinall versus Ciryl Gane, where I'll be discussing the most confident picks, the lock of the week, the underdog of the week, and some parlays that I like. Hope y'all are doing well. Let's dive into the most confident picks, where we got Azat Maxim, Umar Nurmagomedov, and Ikram Aliskerov. Starting out with Umar Nurmagomedov, I feel at first I felt this was going to be a very close fight, but I'm leaning Umar to edge it out. And despite it being a close fight, I'm confident in saying Umar is going to be the one that comes out on top. I'm not going to say it's going to be a dominant performance, but I do expect him to win. I am confident in him winning. I expect competitive rounds, but Umar should be winning the bigger moments of this fight. I've always said Mario Bautista uh, is a high caliber fighter, right? I even picked him to beat Patchy Mix because I saw his skill set, and Patchy Mix was never really that guy. And you can see that before he even entered the UFC. And Mario absolutely proved his quality in that Patchy Mix fight. Watching Bautista fight, you can tell that he's a high caliber athlete. He has clean striking, strong grappling, and excellent timing. And this is why I say it might be a competitive fight. But realistically, Umar, he's just better everywhere the fight goes. Both fighters are well rounded, they're technically sound. Umar's grappling is elite and his striking is crisp, it's fast, and he's really disciplined. He might not have fight ending power, but his timing and his precision make him a really dangerous fighter. Bautista shares a similar style, skilled everywhere, strong grappler, great pace, but I think Umar's speed, his pressure, his control, it's going to give him the edge in the exchanges, right? So even though Mario has great cardio, we've seen him fade and get finished twice in the UFC. Meanwhile, Umar, he has never been finished, even in his loss to Marab, where he reportedly broke his hand early in the fight. Despite that, he's held his own in that fight, right? Umar doesn't break easily. And overall, both guys will mix in striking and wrestling, but Umar tends to be more dominant and composed, while Bautista can get overwhelmed by sustained pressure. I expect Umar to win more of the key exchanges and outwork Mario on the feet and in the grappling scrambles and pull ahead on the scorecards. So I'm gonna say Umar wins this fight by decision. It's gonna be a close competitive fight, but Umar's speed and composure will win him the edge here. Moving on to our next most confident pick, Azat Maxim. I'm taking Azat Maxim to outstrike Mitroposo on the feet. In Azat's debut, he faced Tyson Nam, and he struggled. He struggled a bit. Nam defended 9 out of 11 takedown attempts, and the fight was close despite Nam not being an elite athlete. And after that, Azat was outstruck by Charles Johnson and later outclassed by Tagir Ulanbekov. And those last two losses are forgivable since both opponents are top level talents. But barely edging past Tyson Nam shows Azat might not be ready for that elite level. But fortunately for him, this matchup is an elite level, right? He's facing Mitch Raposo, who's 0-2 in the UFC, both losses coming by split decision to solid fighters, right? Like Andre Lima and Suma Darji. The Andre Lima is a lot more forgivable than the Suma Darji loss, but Raposa himself, he isn't a bad fighter. He moves well, he has clean footwork, and he times his counters nicely, but he tends to stay on the outside for too long, relying on his movement without consistent offense. And he can shoot takedowns effectively, but he struggles to keep opponents down, which cost him in the Sumajarji fight. And if someone like Tagir Ulanbekov wasn't able to take down Azat and Azat was taking Tagir down, I feel that Mitroposo might be having a hard time taking down Azat Maxim himself, and he's coming up against Azat, which is the problem. Azat is difficult to control on the mat and has strong strangles. Like I said, even Tagir Ulanbekov, an elite grappler, had trouble holding him down. And since both men have wrestling backgrounds, their grappling might cancel out, likely turning into a striking match. And if it does, I still give Azat the edge in the on the feet. He's sharper, he's more powerful, and he's more active on the feet. Raposo's low output and lack of pressure will let Azat dictate the pace, land the heavier shots, and likely take control as the fight goes on. So my prediction is Azat Maxim to win by decision. He's gonna be the busier, the stronger, and the more effective fighter in his striking all throughout the fight, right? So moving on to our third most confident pick, we got Ikram. I see a lot of people sleeping on Ikram, but he's always been a confident pick of mine as the week started. He's training with Habib. I feel that in itself gives him a big advantage, and I think Ikram is simply the better fighter in every area this fight goes. If Jung Young Park wants to wrestle, Ikram's takedown defense and sambo base should shut that down. If Park wants to strike, Ikram's the more powerful, precise, and dangerous striker. We've seen Park drop before. He was hurt by Brad Tavares and then knocked out by Gregory Rodriguez, both by whom hit pretty hard, right? If Ikram lands those same shots, they're going to have a much bigger impact. If Park might try to use the volume striking, to set up his grappling, but his punches don't carry much power, and he's yet to record a knockout win in the UFC, which is how Ikram has lost in the UFC or in his career overall by knockout. And Jung Young Park is still yet to record a knockout in the UFC. Ikram, on the other hand, has finished all his UFC fights by knockout, and both of his career losses came against elite level opponents. Park doesn't have that same caliber or kind of power that's proven to hurt Ikram. Combine Ikram's elite sambo background, explosive striking, and physical strength, and he should be able to dictate where this fight takes place. Park's pressure and pace, I don't believe it'll be enough to break down Ikram. Ikram can absorb the volume, stay composed, and find openings for the big counters. Eventually, I see him landing clean. Um, I see him finding that fight-ending shot on the feet. Park can throw leg kicks, he can mix in takedowns and push forward, but Ikram's power, his timing, and defensive awareness should neutralize all of it. So my prediction is going to be Ikram to win this fight by knockout. I think he has superior power in this matchup. He has the sharper striking, and he's strong enough. He has strong enough grappling to keep it standing and find the finish. That concludes the most confident picks. Moving on to the lock of the week. Tom Aspinall. I think Tom Aspinall is just way too good right now. Tom is essentially, he's undefeated in the UFC. His only loss came to Curtis Blades, but that was due to that freak injury in the opening seconds where when they ran it back, Aspinall knocked Blades out in under a minute. And without that injury, he'd have a spotless UFC record. On the other side, Ciryl Gane record looks cleaner than it should. He officially only has 2 losses to Francis Ngannou and John Jones, which are incredibly respectable. But many believe he lost his last fight against Alexander Volkov. So realistically, he should probably have 3 UFC decision losses, right? It's impressive that Gane has never been knocked out. He went the distance with Ngannou and was only submitted by John Jones. So what makes this matchup interesting is that Gane has never been finished by strikes. While Aspinall has never gone the distance. And if Tom can't knock Gane out, he'll have to win on points, right? And something we haven't seen from him yet. Aspinall usually finishes fights in the first round, and it's hard to imagine him doing that against someone as elusive and durable as Gane. I think Aspinall will land something big early. His speed, his explosiveness, and his boxing technique stand out in the heavyweight division. If he lands clean in round 1, even if Gane survives, he'll likely be compromised for the rest of the fight for as long as it lasts, right? Aspinall's combination of elite hand speed, timing, and top control make him a dangerous opponent anywhere the fight goes. So the big question is, what happens if it goes long, right? Gane's footwork, his jab, his kickboxing are world class, right? He's explosive, he's technical, while Aspinall relies more on quick blitzes, forward pressure, and explosive boxing entries. I would give Gane the edge in kickboxing variety, but Aspinall's pure boxing is sharper, and I think that's where this fight will be decided. If Tom closes the distance, controls the center, and mix in body shots with those quick level changes, he'll eventually find that clean shot that changes the fight into his direction. Gane's movement can buy him time, but over 5 rounds, I don't think he can stay perfect against someone as athletic and as powerful as Aspinall, who's going to be hunting him down, using his in and out style the whole fight, right? So I'm predicting Tom to land that knockout shot on Gane, right? Gane's movement and technique may delay it, but Aspinall's explosiveness, his boxing, and his finishing instincts will eventually find the target and put Gane away, right? Moving on to underdog of the week, Azamat Mirzakhanov. I'm not sure if everyone still has underdog value on Azamat Mirzakhanov. I see a lot of money going in on him, but he's underdog of the week. He hurts everybody he fights. Anyone and everyone he fights, he's gonna hurt them, right? I am definitely siding with Azamat Mirzakhanov here. I think he's going to close the distance, apply his trademark pressure, and eventually land one of those monstrous power shots that changes the fight. Mirzakhanov is 5-0 in the UFC, 4 wins by knockout, and he's been doing exactly what a rising contender should do, finishing lower level opponents in dominant fashion. He just stopped Brendan Ribeiro and Alonzo Menifield, not elite names, but solid performances that keep his momentum rolling. Now he faces Alexander Rakic, who on paper looks like his toughest test yet, but when you dig deeper, Rakic's resume, I wouldn't say it's elite level impressive. His best wins are Anthony Smith and Thiago Santos, two veterans who everyone's been beating lately. Against top tier competition like Yuri Prohaskov, Jan Blachowicz, Volkan Ozdemir, and Magomed Ankalaev, he's come up short every single time. Uh, we've kind of seen Rakic's ceiling. A solid technician, but hasn't really broken into that elite level. Meanwhile, Mirzakhanov is on the rise. He's undefeated, full of momentum, and physically built like a tank. Rakic coming off of 3 fight skid losses and a serious ACL injury, he hasn't looked the same since he hasn't looked like the same fighter since, right? Rakic's his best weapons, in my opinion, it's gonna be those heavy leg kicks. He uses them really well, and especially against Yuri Prohaskov in their fight. But even then, Yuri walked straight through them, switched stances, and dropped him in round 2. That kind of pressure is exactly what Mirzakhanov brings. He doesn't back off even after eating those big shots. He's compact, he's built, and he's got that explosive power, which let him generate those fight-ending forces in those short bursts that he uses in his blitzes, right? So I see this mostly staying on the feet with Mirzakhanov landing the more damaging shots. He's got strong wrestling as well and knows how to mix it in just enough to keep his opponents guessing, right? While Rakic might look cleaner technically, Azamat's pace, his timing, and his raw power make him the more dangerous man in this matchup. So Rakic might start well, but Mirzakhanov's pressure will wear him down. And once he finds that clean entry and lands, the momentum will completely swing into his favor. So I'm predicting Azamat Mirzakhanov to win this fight by knockout. And I just think his pressure, his power, and composure, they prove too much for Rakic, right? That concludes Underdog of the Week. Moving on to the parlay section, where we got the safety log. It's not the greatest odds, but it's as safe as you can get. I'm playing it safe. Aspinall and Umar at minus 215. Do whatever you want with that because, in my opinion, that has the best chance of hitting out of any fights on the card, right? Aspinall has all the tools, speed, power, top tier composure to eventually break Gane down. If it's not, even if it's not an early knockout, he's the more complete fighter everywhere the fight goes. And pairing that up with Umar Nurmagomedov, Umar is one of the most well-rounded prospects in the division. He's elite in both striking and grappling, and he doesn't make any mistakes. Both are elite tier, technically superior fighters who rarely leaves openings. The only danger is if Gane survives long enough and steals late rounds, or if Umar Bautista turns into a razor close technical duel. But I think it's a great anchor parlay. It's low risk and it's a disciplined pick. I see Aspinall getting the knockout and Umar being better everywhere the fight goes. Moving on to the ultimate lock at minus 125. This is where the odds start getting a bit juicier. Maxim to win and Verna Dern over 2.5. It's a 5-round fight. Um, I feel the over 2.5 is smart. In their first fight, it went over 2.5, and this is a 5 round fight. Both are elite grapplers, so it's unlikely either submits the other early on. And historically, grappler versus grappler matchups tend to turn into long, grindy fights that hit the scorecards just like their first fight did, right? And then pairing that up with Azat Maxim, I think Azat should handle Mitch Raposo. He's faster, stronger, and more polished overall. Raposo's movement is solid, but his low output and his inability to control opponents on the ground make him a tough pick to trust. Maxim's scrambling and defense should keep him in control long enough to win a clear decision. Moving on to the Iron Lock, Umar and Maxim Raposo over 2.5 at -115. This is like me saying Maxim is going to win this fight by decision. You're just pairing that up with Umar. Maxim fight going over 2.5. I think that plays out perfectly. Both are technical fighters who are most likely going to fight from range. Maxim's defense and Raposo's movement both push this one towards the cards. So I see the Maxim winning by decision. Just pair that up with uh just pair the over 2.5 up with Umar, who's elite everywhere, crisp striking, suffocating takedowns, and strong fight IQ. Against Mario Bautista, he'll likely mix it up. He'll mix up his striking and top control to win rounds by basically winning more minutes of this fight, right? Moving on to the more juicier odds. Most confident picks, the four most confident picks: Aspinall, Umar, Maxim, Ikram. Aspinall's explosiveness versus Gane's finesse. I see Aspinall's coming through. Umar's elite wrestling and ground control, Maxim's scrambling and his activity, Ikram's composure and one-shot power versus Park. All four are logical favorites. It's a better fighter parlay without a reckless leg. The only risk is the volume of legs here. If one messes up, it all comes crashing down. But I think it comes through. It's an excellent confidence combination, and at +160, it's solid value for four legitimate favorites. Moving on to the fun duo parlay, Jalton and Delgado. Jalton Almeida has a massive grappling edge over Volkov. If he gets him down, it's probably a wrap. And pairing that up with Jose Delgado, a rising striker with clean hands and timing, his matchup favors his pressure style, in my opinion. But it's risky because Almeida's cardio and tendency to fade if the takedowns don't come through is the concern, and Delgado's still somewhat unproven at this level. But it's a fun parlay with finishing upside on both ends. Jose is a finisher, and sorry, and Almeida has been getting finishes lately as well, right? Moving on to if which could end up being the greatest parlay of all time if this hits. It has a serious chance of hitting. The Underdog City, Azamat Murzakanov, Killian Sackfield, Matthias Camilo. Murzakanov, obviously a live dog with knockout power and pressure, a real chance to crack Rakic. Killian Sackfield is a sharp, fast rising prospect with explosive striking and well-rounded everywhere. Stylistically, he's solid. Matthias Camilo, he brings a dynamic offense and underrated durability, right? So I think this has a real big chance of hitting at +680. It's a great long shot value, that kind of swing for the fences parlay that makes sense for a small stake excitement. Definitely don't put your entire bankroll on this unless you want to, right? But that does conclude this card's best bets for this week. Hope you found this helpful. Take care of yourselves, guys. I love y'all, boys. Good luck. I'm out. Peace.